as we continue with our program of discussions and activities. In just a moment, we'll continue with the next panel, Mainstreaming Gender into Nuclear Non-proliferation and Disarmament. But before we do so, I'd like to draw your attention to some changes to the program that have been made for tomorrow. You should already have received, I hope, some notifications about this. If you check out your conference app, you will find the details. The first session tomorrow morning will start at 9 a.m. It was previously 10 a.m., so it will start at 9 a.m. We will also have a briefing on the simulation exercise that will be conducted on Thursday and Friday. In addition to that, there is a new session from 11:30 to 1 p.m. tomorrow, which will be a French language roundtable on CTBT issues. Everybody is welcome, whatever one's level of French is. It will take place in this room from 11:30 to 1 p.m. and it will be followed by a reception kindly hosted by the Permanent Mission of France. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to Ms. Laura Rockwood, who is joining us as moderator of today's session. For those of you who don't know Laura, and there are probably not very many in that category, she is currently serving as the executive director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-proliferation, and she has many years' experience in safeguards issues with the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm going to leave further introductions to Laura. Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's always a tough session right after lunch, but we're going to try to make sure that we keep this interesting and challenging and relevant to all of your work. In 2015, the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The fifth was achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Unfortunately, as reflected in the World Economic Forum's 2017 Global Gender Gap Report, which looks at differences between men and women in health, economics, politics, and education, there's been a downward trend in equal pay. The pay gap is widening rather than decreasing. UN Women, the UN organization dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women, also recently published relevant and somewhat disheartening statistics. Women remain underrepresented in leadership and management level positions in both the public and private sectors, with less than 1/3 of senior and middle management positions in businesses held by women. And as of 2017, only 23.4% of all national parliamentarians are women. The question we're addressing today is perhaps a subset of these issues. A study in the UK recently showed that on average, 20% of the workforce in the nuclear sector consisted of women, only 20%. And according to a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers, only 8% of women held board positions, 8 out of a possible 100 positions. Why is this? What can be done about it? How can the nuclear security, non-proliferation, disarmament community break down the stereotypes that impede women in the workplace? There is a growing number of associations dedicated to correcting this imbalance, including an organization called Women in Nuclear, a worldwide nonprofit association established in 1993 by a small group of women working in a variety of nuclear fields in Europe and the US. WIN currently has 35,000 members, men and women, from over 100 countries. They have over 32 national, regional, and international chapters. Another recent initiative is the International Gender Champions. The IGC is a network, a leadership network that brings together female and male decision makers determined to break down gender barriers and make gender equality a working reality in their spheres of influence. The initiative was launched in 2015 in Geneva, and a Vienna hub was created here in Vienna in 2016. They now also have hubs in New York and Nairobi. All gender champions sign what we call the Panel Parity Pledge. We do this carefully because it's hard to say. The Panel Parity Pledge to no longer sit on single gender panels, which is the core of the IGC initiative. Gender champions also make 2 individualized commitments that pertain to new or ongoing work to achieve gender equality in their respective organizations and activities. As of today, the network numbers over 200 active champions and alumni, including Lassina Zerbo, UN Secretary General Guterres, and the IAEA Director General Amano. As a female executive and a former staff member of the IAEA, I'm also proud to be an international gender champion. 2 of our panelists here today are also gender champions, Ambassador Mitsuru Kitano from Japan and Ambassador Andrej Benedejčič from Slovenia. And before we get started, I thought I'd give you a little bit about their background. Ambassador Benedejčič is the permanent representative of Slovenia to the CTBTO and the UN organizations here in Vienna. He's served as the permanent representative of Slovenia to the UN, to the OSCE, which resides on the other side of the Danube, and the other international organizations in Vienna for the last 3 years. Prior to that, he served as the permanent representative of Slovenia at NATO in Brussels and as the foreign policy advisor to both the President and the Prime Minister of Slovenia. Ambassador Kitano is the permanent representative of Japan to the CTBTO and the other UN organizations here. During his career with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which he joined in 1980, he served in various capacities, among them Ambassador and Director General of the Disarmament, Non-proliferation, and Science Department. He also happens to be an upstairs neighbor of the VCDNP and generously offers his conference room when our events are filled to capacity. Our next speaker will be Courtney Lindley, who is the chief of the procurement section at CTBTO's administration division. She joined CTBTO in 2005 after working for 15 years in the private sector. She's worked in various procurement and project planning capacities at the CTBT, including the IDC, the Office of the Executive Secretary, and administration. And finally, Grace Liu. She actually spoke to us on Friday about her research on the North Korean issue using open source information and analysis. If you recall, she is a research associate in the East Asian Non-proliferation Program at CNS, where she focuses on applying new tools, 3D modeling techniques, and open source intelligence to verify compliance to arms control treaties. I don't know how her French is, but apparently she is a Korean and Mandarin linguist and has served for several years as an analyst for the armed services. So, what does this have to do with you? How does this relate to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament? You're probably sitting there asking, what does gender have to do with it? What do women bring to the table? Do we bring something different? Do we bring particular sensibility to the negotiation of arms control agreements? I'm really interested to hear what our panelists have to say, and I'm hoping that while they are speaking, you're identifying questions that you want to ask us as well, because I think the most important way to improve gender parity is through communication and mutual learning. Without any further ado, Ambassador Benedejčič.
Thank you, and thank you for your perfect pronunciation of my last name, which is sometimes a challenge for non-native speakers. I have to say that I'm very glad to be here at this event, which is a CTBT event. And that is because my interest in gender-related issues is also connected to CTBT. 2 years ago, in September of 2016, the executive secretary of the CTBTO, Dr. Lassina Zerbo, took part in a special conference in Slovenia, which we call the Bled Strategic Forum. And he was actually a panelist on a panel which was dedicated to the issue of non-proliferation and disarmament in Europe. And when he started speaking, he told us that he's very glad to be in Slovenia, but that next time around, he would really like to ask us to make sure that there are also women on the panel, because on the panel of 6, there were only 6 men. Needless to say, all the successive conferences that we have organized have been gender balanced. And needless to say, I also very much took what he said to heart. And I became especially interested in what he called the panel parity pledge that he had signed up to. And he had basically signed up to the original panel parity pledge, which was launched in Geneva, as mentioned earlier. So when in January of last year, I was asked to join the initiative to also establish a chapter of the International Gender Champions in Vienna, I readily joined the initiative. And I'm therefore glad to say that in June of last year, we launched the chapter here in Vienna as well, and more than 50 heads of missions in Vienna are already members. But what I think is even more important is that all of the heads of international organizations here in Vienna have also joined this initiative. I think that this is very important for a number of reasons, but one of them is also the specificity of Vienna. Vienna is specific in the sense that it is full of organizations that deal with similar issues. You can basically divide them into 2 groups, either very science and technical oriented organizations or security oriented organizations. But in that sense, they also have something else in common, and that is that they are dealing with what one could call traditionally male-dominated fields. And in that sense, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that, for example, the percentage of women in leadership positions at the International Atomic Energy Agency is similar to the percentage at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it is about 1/3. So it makes sense to compare notes here in Vienna, to exchange experiences, and to see how things can be improved. Also because if you look at the organizations here, you will see that they deal with issues that are nuclear related, and then also with issues that have to do with disarmament, non-proliferation. So in that sense, I think that we can actually already look at some of the experiences from this field. Having mentioned the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I would like to say that I'm currently chairing one of its decision-making organs, which is called the Forum for Security Cooperation. It is the part of the OSCE which really focuses on the politico-military dimensions of security. And ever since the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis in 2014, this particular aspect of the work of the OSCE has become more important than ever, because it is now one of the few still existing and still functioning mechanisms that we have for military transparency and predictability in Europe. So we decided to make sure that during all of the sessions that we hold during our chairmanship, we also address the gender perspective. So basically what I'm doing is I'm mainstreaming gender perspective into our chairmanship by ensuring that panel parity pledge is respected when it comes to the composition of the various panels, and also to make sure that the discussion of the panels also addresses the issue of the importance of gender in security-related issues. In this connection, I would like to say that one of the questions that was addressed directly head-on during a recent discussion on women, peace and security was precisely the question of why is it important to have, for instance, more women in our operations these days. And it transpired that, of course, because of the changing nature of conflict, the presence of women, either in peacekeeping or military operations, or operations such as the special monitoring mission of the OSCE in Ukraine, is important because you are dealing with hybrid conflicts, and most of the time you're also dealing with the civilians on the ground. And a big portion of the civilians are women and also children. And in that sense, it is important that your force also has interlocutors that these civilians find approachable, also women. And it is also important that you have in your force people with the social skills who are able to gather the necessary information that is especially important for any commander of such an operation that is becoming more and more commonplace today. And again, experience shows that a commander who has actually women in his force has a better situational awareness than is the case if you only have only, shall I say, male-dominated unit. We also addressed the issue, for example, during a discussion that we had last week on nuclear security in the OSCE area. We had this discussion because actually most of the nuclear facilities and nuclear materials are located in the 57 participating states of the OSCE. And of course, nuclear security is a specific topic, but here too, the importance of gender mainstreaming was emphasized for the simple reason that as times progress, there is more and more emphasis on insider threats and not only on the physical protection of nuclear facilities. And then, therefore, again, it is important to have a balanced composition of the personnel, and again, also better situational awareness and better social skills. And I also would like to mention a special session that we had on the confidence and security building measures and on arms control in Europe. Here I would like to say that that session also highlighted the work on this side of the river, a special program that was organized in February by the United Nations Office on Disarmament Affairs, which really specifically targeted young women for the training on issues of non-proliferation and disarmament, also in the nuclear sphere. But what I would like to emphasize is that during the discussion which took place, and the people who were discussing these issues were the primary authorities in the field of CSBMs and arms control, it transpired that because of the different security situation in Europe in the past, the number of experts on disarmament and non-proliferation has actually gone down. There are less people who actually understand this subject. This particular field has to be strengthened with new experts, with new professionals. And in that sense, I would say that this is now the perfect opportunity also for women, as women also to enter this field, because there is a lack of trained professionals in it. And not only when it comes to the issue of nuclear non-proliferation disarmament, but to the issue of non-proliferation and disarmament in general. So there is a number of reasons why I think it is important for us to be discussing the issue of gender mainstreaming also in this field. And I also think that it is important to remember that when it comes to the nuclear field in general, times are also changing. For example, when the nuclear infrastructure in Slovenia was established, and Slovenia is one of 30 countries with a fully fledged civilian nuclear program, the nuclear field was completely male-dominated. It was basically 100% male-dominated, to the extent that our national authority on nuclear issues actually had on its premises only one bathroom facility. That, of course, had to change with time. And today I'm happy to announce that our nuclear administration is composed 40% of women. So things can change, and they can also change quickly if needed. There are, of course, also challenges in the nuclear area when it comes to nuclear security. For instance, only 5%, as far as I understand, of specialists are women. So there is room for improvement. But as I think, or I hope I explained to you, also because of the different security situation in the world and in Europe, this is perhaps a very exciting time also to make sure that there are not only more women professionals when it comes to non-proliferation disarmament, but also when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. And with that, I would like to thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent example of taking personal responsibility for promoting gender parity. When you see it, you fix it, and you're in a position to do that. And the ambassador has been personally engaged in this issue for some time. Our next speaker will be Courtney Lindley, who will perhaps give us a perspective from the CTBT point of view and a little bit about the youth group perhaps as well.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. I'll start by saying how pleased I was to attend the high-level opening of this event on Friday and listen to the distinguished, articulate, and highly competent women who opened this event. There was Karen Kneissl, who is the Federal Minister for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Austria. There was Elba Rosa Perez Montoya, the Minister for Science and Technology and the Environment of Cuba. And there was Izumi Nakamitsu, the UN High Representative for Disarmament and Affairs. They all had some important points to make. Some of these were that international law has been harshly infringed over the last few years, and that all nations and all people must participate in nuclear non-proliferation, sustainable development, and climate change. That women must be fully involved in disarmament and non-proliferation, and that internal conflicts nowadays are rarely internal, that practical steps are needed to reduce tensions, and that means that there needs to be more dialogue versus more arms. Disarmament is at the heart of collective security, and we are currently living with a precarious international security backdrop. These were the points made in that session. Then there were some key points also made by Lord Desmond Brown, which is that over the last few years, there's been a serious erosion of trust and confidence in the world, and that trust must be built for future generations. And he commented on the unhealthy spending on military spending. And he said, and we see this today, that dialogue is often suspended when it's needed the most. He recognized that many threats have been generated by advances in technology, and he noted that science will always try to push the boundaries, but it's up to the people to make sure that they constrain the negative effects. Perhaps a flaw in the current system is that people at the peace table are most often the ones holding the guns. If you cut to the basics, what is war all about? It's about competition, it's about power, and it's about wealth. Decisions are often taken with blatant disregard for all the horrific side effects of war, and many of those are borne by people with no involvement in the decision. So what do women bring to the peace and non-proliferation disarmament table? The question that Laura asked. I believe they bring dialogue and communication. They bring a commitment and a long-term perspective towards peace and security. They bring the important realization that violence is not a solution to the world's challenges, and a sense of community and appreciation for the value of each individual and for human life. I read an interesting and telling statistic. A September 2015 report from UN Women highlighted that from 1992 to 2011, only 9% of negotiators at peace tables were women. Gender mainstreaming provides a pluralistic approach that values the diversity between men and women. It assesses the implications of policy and programs for both men and women at all levels and in all areas. Some key principles include gender-sensitive language, gender-specific data collection and analysis, i.e. making life's realities visible, equal access and utilization of services, equal involvement in decision-making, and equal treatment integrated into the steering process. An important thing to consider in an international organization such as the CTBTO is that of culture. You have staff from societies with egalitarian values, as well as from societies where there's a very uneven distribution of power. I believe that this makes it all the more important when building a strong organization to create a clear and inclusive organizational culture, which has to supersede the many national cultures that make up the whole. An organization is successful because of the people who work there, and it can only be successful if it is utilizing all the talents and all the innovation or innovative ideas of 100% of its workforce. Both men and women bring diverse and important perspectives to the table. Like many international organizations, the Secretariat gives particular emphasis to improving the representation of women in the professional categories, but it recognizes that there is still a great deal of work to do. The PTS continued its efforts to increase the representation of women in the fixed-term professional category in 2007, and there was a slight increase over 2017, and there was a slight increase over 2016. However, there are still only 32.28% of the professional staff in 2017 that are women. Whereas in the general services category, representation is of course higher than male representation by almost 15%. Some positive points to consider are that from 2011 to 2017, the number of female professional staff has risen steadily, despite a decrease over the last year in the number of applications of women. Of the 6 director positions, 2 are occupied by women, and one position is vacant and another will be opening soon, providing an opportunity for gender parity at the highest staffing levels. So what is CTBTO doing to further gender mainstreaming? Our Human Resources Services is in the process of updating policies with regard to gender equality in areas such as uncertified sick leave and family leave, maternity and paternity leave, adoption leave, breastfeeding policies, leave for military service, and leave for childcare. The Executive Secretary, as one of the gender champions, as already mentioned, has focused his goals on building the capacities and portfolios of women in science, diplomacy, and other areas. He's keenly aware that the success of any organization is also dependent on its sustainability. He launched the CTBTO youth group a few years ago, and its membership has now grown to over 400 worldwide, the majority of which are young women. He's also committed to institute, by the end of 2018, an annual CTBTO shadowing program in which up to 10 promising students from high school up, with a 4-to-1 ratio of women to men, can follow the work of a professional in their desired field within the CTBTO for a period of 2 to 3 weeks to encourage gender parity at higher levels of management, science, and diplomacy. The purpose of the program is to create equal opportunities for young men and women to eventually obtain high-level positions in their fields of interest, and by equipping them with the early understanding and tools and connections necessary for professional development. This symposium focuses on the extremely important intersection of science and diplomacy, and as discussed in a number of the forums, in cases where diplomacy may break down, science often offers a way to continue collaboration and innovation and find common ground. One of the projects we are keen to launch at the CTBTO is a Women in Science pipeline. The purpose of this project would be to develop a network of highly qualified female scientists of diverse geographical backgrounds who could be identified and encouraged to apply for scientific positions in international organizations, including the CTBTO. We would hope to partner with other universities and professional organizations to identify these potential candidates, and we already have positive indication from some permanent missions who may be interested in supporting this initiative, and we're working to consolidate a concept. We believe that such a project would help to boost the number of applicants to technical positions in the organization, and it would provide additional support and outreach to qualified women who may have questions about or concerns about working for an international organization and how that might affect their scientific career. And can they publish their papers and things while they're working there? Such a project would also serve to provide additional information and support to those potential candidates. So just to wrap up my intro, I believe the Executive Secretary's quote on the International Gender Champions website sums up this session nicely, and our goal nicely. He says, "The achievement of gender parity will represent not only the important, long overdue realization of basic human rights, but a real and significant force in the attainment and nuclear non-proliferation and peace." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Kitano.
Thank you very much, Laura, and I'm very much happy to be here as one of the panelists on this important session. Looking from here, I suppose the room is very much well balanced, and I suppose it is already a very good indication to discuss this matter, because I'm very much convinced that this issue is not only an issue for women, but this is something that everybody should join to discuss this issue. And first, I would like to discuss, when I think about gender issues, I have two sets of issues in my mind, so I would like to touch upon that, and then I would like to elaborate what kind of things I can offer, and I'm thinking about improved or enhanced gender participation. And when I said that, I have two sets of issues. These are one is issue of participation, and the other is the issue of substance. The issue of participation is something like, as I said, the room is balanced representation, and such things as panel parity pledge, and this is a question of participation. On the other hand, the issue of substance, and that is something which I would like to elaborate a little bit. And the issue of substance and gender is a part of the whole issue, social issue. And gender is a consequence of an whole issue, or gender can be a solution of these issues. And let me explain a little bit. When we discuss about development, and water supply is very much important. And one of the importance of water supply is that in the world, millions of people, millions of women, take a long walk carrying a very heavy a water jug and take a long walk. And so water supply, and if you come up with an additional source of water supply, and we can eliminate this kind of work. And that is one example. And here in Vienna, I'm also involved for the discussion in the framework of UNODC, and there we discuss about crime and drug. And taking the example of crime, and we discuss about an issue, women as a victim. And there we discuss about human trafficking and crime against women. And also we discuss about women as offenders. And there we discuss about the treatment of female prisoners and what kind of treatment we can offer to them, and special consideration for giving birth, and what to do with raise children, and all the issues are involved to that. And also we can discuss about women as enablers in a sense. So, also in the context of crime, and wives and mothers can play a very important role to prevent those who are young people being lured into extremism. So, gender can be a source of providing solution for that. Then now, here we are here to discuss about the issue of non-proliferation disarmament, and how to think about an issue of substance in this context. Maybe when we limit ourselves in discussing about a nuclear weapon, and nuclear weapon would not discriminate women from men, so there would be no point of discussing about women as a victim, women as offenders, and other than those who are affected by radiation, and what to think about the next generation's issue, and so on. But one thing which I would like to draw your attention is that just aspect of women as enablers. And the case which I would like to share with you is the incident which is called incident of Lucky Dragon number 5. What is Lucky Dragon number 5? It is a name of vessel and which was affected by nuclear testing in 1954, 1st of March. And as you know, in 1950s was a period, and a lot of nuclear testing was conducted. And it was a nuclear testing which was called Operation Castle Bravo, conducted by the United States and near Bikini Atoll. The problem is that the fallout of nuclear testing was much bigger, much wider than calculated, expected. And there are many, many fishing boats in this area, and Lucky Dragon number 5 was one of those fishing vessels. And all 23 crew members severely affected by that, and one person died out of it. And it was a kind of start of several movement in Japan against nuclear testing. And what I would like to mention down here in the gender context is that it was housewives in Tokyo and who was a main force to drive that movement. And we also, I suppose, and this is one example, and we come across, in not only in Japan but in other parts of the world, and we across a lot of cases women driving force of such a movement. So I suppose it is with good reason that we also think about this issue of substance issue, and which is distinct from a participation issue. And I suppose I very much thank Benedejčič talking about the security issues in general. And he talked about an asymmetrical warfare and where women and children are victims. And I suppose that is one of the examples and how gender is a part of the whole issue. So, this is something which I would like to offer in the first half of my presentation. In the latter half of my presentation, I would like to share with you three things which I care about women's participation. There are three. And the first is caring about gender balance. That is very much first step. And in order to caring about gender balance, there are several things which we are to have in our mind. One is realizing unconscious gender bias. And over the course of the International Women's Day, I had a chance to hear very much useful, valuable talks. But one of the things which I learned is that everybody has bias, and everybody is not free from bias. And I also have it, and maybe you have it. And it is very much important that we become conscious of it. So I suppose that is very much one important step. But the other thing is that make an intentional effort to redress the situation. And I'm a head of permanent mission. And one of the the difference between my position and those who are the chief and head of the international organization, and I know that as Laura mentioned, many of the international organization head has become an international gender champion. And I'm not in full control of what to do with staff issue. And I'm a part of, my permanent nation is a part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and I cannot make an independent decision whom to hire, whom to work with, and in the mission. But there are things which we can do. And for example, when we organize a workshop, symposium, and we can care about the gender balance. And this is very much in line with the idea and panel parity pledge, and which has been mentioned several times. So, there are things which we can do. And now I would like to offer one very much recent development in Japan. Japan is not a country which women are very much well represented in political scene. And but one legislation which passed quite recently, less than 2 weeks ago, is that legislation to promote gender equality in political sphere. The basic goal, which is provided for in that legislation, is that aim at equal number of candidates for elections, and ask political parties to make voluntary effort in that direction. So, and I read this morning all the provisions for that, and it also talk about, we have to respect the freedom and their discretion, their idea for each political party, but still, let's aim at to that basic goal. So the idea is ask political party when they present the candidature as equal as possible, candidature would be very much well recommended. So that is the idea. So this is something one example which is introduced in Japan's context. The second thing which I would like to mention is that providing an enabling environment, and oftentimes participation, and it is very much important to think about the supporting mechanism for that. So in the wider social context, and we should think about child care facilities and enhance and expand that, and also housekeeping services, and how we can provide more availability to these services. So these kind of things are very much important in terms of society as a whole. And as a permanent mission, we cannot organize these kind of big instrument. But there are things which we can do. And one of the things which we introduce is that we have introduced a mechanism of flexible working hours. And that is very much conducive for those who are working women, and it is also help those not only women but also men who are to take care of children, and so overall this is something which would provide a better environment for those who are working. So, and it is also in line with one of the commitment which I made when I became an international gender champion. And the last thing which I would like to offer is that it is very much important to encourage and support pioneer women. And this is another thing which I very much I was impressed in hearing various talks in the International Women's Day interventions. And I very much felt that those who took the floor in the International Women's Day, they are all pioneers. And I very much felt that they have addressed and broke the glass ceiling in their capacities. So it is very much important that we would provide a conducive environment for them, and that would very much lead to those younger generation would follow suit. And here also I would like to make one example from Japan's case. And as has been mentioned from previous speakers, this area non-proliferation, disarmament, and we discussed a lot of STEM-related issues: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And sometimes it is said that STEM is one of the challenging area for women. And in Japan, it has been over more than 20 years, and we have had a special prize, which is called Saruhashi Prize, naming after the very much excellent women scientists. And it is a prize to encourage young Japanese women researchers in the area of natural science. And so it is only given to women, and so it is women specific, and in order to acknowledge the great work she's doing, but at the same time it gives more ripple effect, which would encourage those who are following suit to those scientists. So, I suppose this is one thing which is we are having in Japan, and I suppose this kind of things would take time. But compared to the time when I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and it was around 30 years ago, a lot have changed. And Some might feel that the pace of changing is not fast enough, but I very much feel that there is a changing and which is operating. So what I would like to do is to be a part of this change. Thank you very much.
Terrific example, concrete examples of what can be done to encourage the engagement of women in the substantive issues as well. Thank you, Mitsuru. I myself am unsure whether women negotiate differently from men. But what I do know is that diversity breeds innovation. And diversity isn't just about gender, it's culture, it's age. And in that context, I would very much like to introduce Grace to have another conversation with our participants here.
Thank you, Laura. So I am very lucky to have been born and raised in an era where women's rights and gender equality have already made great strides. So growing up, 15, 20 years ago, I didn't feel like I had any experiences where gender was the reason that set me so strictly apart from other people or from attaining certain opportunities. But I do want to share with you a story, and I think when I think of gender equality and the issue of women's rights in general, this is, I think, the example that comes to mind, because this was the first time where I had felt specifically that it was because of my gender and possibly other, cultural, racial dimensions that really changed my experience in that moment. So as Laura mentioned, I've spent several years as an analyst in the U.S. military, and this experience comes from one of my first experiences at boot camp, which is a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. So during boot camp, for one of the field exercises, they designated a couple of leaders to lead the exercise. So for this, I was one of the designated leaders, so they told me, so you go to this certain drill sergeant and receive this brief. So he'll tell you, what the mission's about, so you can go and prepare and lead your troops through this exercise. So, of course, also in boot camp, we had this battle buddy system, so no one would get lost and there would be no soldier left behind. So I just pick a random battle buddy. Just if you can think of the most quintessential American soldier type. He's tall, white kid with buzz cut hair. So I pick him as my battle buddy. We walk over to the drill sergeant. Of course, they're very on point. So the drill sergeant just immediately starts briefing and gives us this 10-15 minute long brief about what the exercise is and what he expects from the leadership. This entire time, he has not broken eye contact with my random battle buddy friend. He's maybe glanced over at me a couple times. But at the end of this long brief, he stares the other guy straight in the face and says, "So, do you have any questions for me?" And bless his soul, my friend goes, "I don't know, don't ask me, she's in charge." So this was, I guess, a good example of how assumptions can be really damaging and potentially prevent women from advancing their, in the workplace or in some role, because of the subconscious biases that the ambassador has already alluded to. And I guess this is a very easy fix, if we can call it that, just because it seems so superficial, but if we dive into it, it's actually not. But one of the things that I believe we can do to fix this assumption of what someone in a role may look like is to, again, emphasize the value of diversity in leadership positions. And I think it's great that we already have such great leaders like Courtney and Laura in these positions to change that stereotype of what a leader in a certain industry looks like. But I also wanted to emphasize this story because it, I think, portrays that women walk through this world differently, in that the world interacts with us differently, and therefore we have to interact back in a certain manner as well. And more broadly, this again, like Laura has mentioned, applies to not just gender, but culture, race, and other demographic factors as well. So I really want to emphasize the importance of diversity in a field that I'm familiar with, which is research, and in policymaking, and that diversity has such ethical implications, like we've already talked about, but also practical implications. In research, of course, when we're conducting an experiment, we emphasize that we need a good sample size, we need a truly random selection so that the experimental population is representative of the larger population, and that contributes to a more accurate study. Well, I'd like to posit that this should also apply to the researchers themselves, and then furthermore for policymakers and people in leadership, in that we should all be more representative of the population as a whole. And I really believe that this, in a very practical sense, improving diversity leads to better quality research because of the diversity of perspectives, and then therefore more effective policy in the end. And so yes, I have a couple recommendations from my so far short-lived professional career. But the first one is for those in leadership, for those who are in positions where you can make immediate change, is to go ahead and make those fixes. And realize the significance of diversity and getting those differing perspectives in the workplace, and emphasize that diversity and empower more women and people in minority populations to be able to step up and have more opportunities to have their voices heard. And lastly, I think there's small changes that we can make on a daily basis that will contribute to the norm forming as a whole. And so the first is something that I find myself caught up in more often than I should, and I'm becoming more cognizant of it. But for instance, when I'm talking to a colleague or a friend and they say, oh, well, I happen to know this expert in this field, I'll find myself asking, oh, so what's his name? And it's very simple to just, try not to assume gender. And a couple of times, of course, more than a couple times, more often than not, I'll get caught off guard and they'll say, oh, well, she's a she, it's a woman, not a man. So it always makes you think twice, but just be more cognizant of small biases like that. And then lastly, I think it would be really great if we could have more of a prevalence of traditionally feminine or components more, I guess, associated with femininity in the professional workplace. I'd love to see more skirts, bright red lipstick, floral pattern. I think that would be fantastic. It would look great in this room. But I think that will also be the first steps in our society as a whole being able to equate things traditionally associated with femininity with professionalism, expertise, and wisdom. Thank you.
Wow, some really great thoughts. I was particularly personally touched by what you said, and I will make note of this and write it down. Women walk through this world differently. That's just fabulous. Ambassador, as you're trying to figure out what questions you want to ask, I would like you to share with us a story you told us just before the panel about what happened recently with the political parties in your election, keeping in mind Mitsuru's comment about the voluntary measure encouraging political parties to have a gender-balanced slate, if you will. You were telling us that recently that two of the parties were not able to...
Yes, well, several years ago, the Slovenian government adopted a provision whereby when it comes to local elections, lists have to contain at least 40% of the other gender, and lists for the parliamentary elections have to contain at least 35% of the other gender when it comes to candidates. This means that if you're running in Slovenia, a political party should, and you have a list of, 100 candidates, 35 of them have to be either women or men. So it doesn't have to be 50-50, but you have to aim at least for 35%. So what happened 2 weeks ago was that the Electoral Commission excluded from elections 2 parties. One was a left-wing party because it had too many women, and the other one was the right-wing party because it had too many men. So both parties were a bit surprised, but that was the decision, and it did send a rather clear message. I also have to say that when a couple of years ago we adopted at the Foreign Ministry of Slovenia a decision that we shall make sure that leadership positions are composed of at least 40% of one gender, that created a big change very quickly. And today, in fact, I think that the majority of director generals are women, and already almost a half of our ambassadors abroad are also women. So in that sense, I think that a sensible approach when it comes to quotas can help a lot. And I think that this approach of 35 or 40% can be better than aiming for an exact figure, for example, of 50%. Because sometimes then you can actually overshoot, and that is also a good thing.
And let's not forget, in a time of changing genders, shifting identities, we may have 20% of the workforce who don't identify with either male or female. So I'm also going to address something to Courtney and to Ambassador Kitano about STEM studies, science studies, engaging women in. And Courtney, you mentioned a recent decrease in the number of female applicants to the CTBT. I find that troubling. On the other hand, we see a slight majority of women among the youth group. So I'd like to have you talk a little bit about that kind of imbalance. And Mitsuru, if you, one of the things I've experienced at the IAEA is there tends to be a tension in personnel hiring policies because many of the women who apply for positions that are presumed to be well qualified seem to be coming from developed countries. And there is a tension with people from developing countries. I personally don't like to see that tension, but I'd love to hear from you as an ambassador to the IAEA about your take on that. But first, Courtney.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. It may have just been a blip for this year, the decrease in applications of women. However, in general, we do find that it is difficult to find enough women applicants for many of the very technical positions that we have at the organization. And therefore, we are looking for ways, and as I mentioned, that's why we are looking to start this pipeline. We're looking for ways to increase the number of applicants. Regardless of the fact that we have gotten less applicants, we are hiring proportionally more women because there is a focus at the CTBTO to make sure that we move towards more gender parity. So, I mean, I would actually be open to hearing ideas from the audience because it's always good to hear ideas from other areas. How do you think we can increase the number of applicants to jobs such as these?
Thank you very much, and for a very difficult question. But I suppose when we discuss about how can I say staffing issue of international organizations, and what I very much think is important is a balance in a broader sense, and a balance and men and women, balance from region, balance from country and representation. So, and I suppose secretariat and would be would receive a good confidence from the member states, and when it is a good composition of a team represented from these standpoint. And so, if the situation would be when we discuss about performance, and there would be a very much single-handed or one-sided distribution, and that would be the problem. But my sense is that general trend is that we have a wide range of very much personnel and good skills and good background from all over the world. So I'm not very much pessimistic for the future picture of international organizations and staffing issue. I very much would like to, it is my general sense that the general trend would be moving toward a good balance, and both from men and women and gender issues, both from regional representation. Thank you.
I only give you the tough questions because I know you can handle them. So, if anybody would like to make a comment or raise a question, please could you introduce yourself and indicate to whom you would address your question or comment, and I see a hand over here.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Espinosa. I'm from Chile. And I have two comments that are really more like directed to everybody in the panel. I would like to start by congratulating you for this wonderful panel. I think this is the way that we start the discussion on the relevance of including gender in these relevant processes. Now, I have one comment that is related with something that was said here regarding the impact, the health impact, the impact of nuclear weapons in female or male. There are some studies that had shown that there is a gender this impact that it's different from female to male. That shows, for instance, in the case of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima, as well as in the case of the disaster in Chernobyl, the case that there were more women that were developing certain type of cancer, leading through the kind of radiation that they were affected by. So there is a different type of impact that female and male suffer through the contact with radiation. And secondly, there is another element that I think it's being also analyzed in some studies that has to do with the social impact that is also different between female and male. In the case of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as in the case of the Marshall Islands, for instance, many women face the stigma from, like in terms of their ability to procreate and their ability to be fitted for marriage because of their exposure to the radiation. So these are elements that we need to take into account when we analyze why women are so relevant in these processes. From the resolution of the 1325, when it was acknowledged, like the need to include women in the peace processes, it's been always acknowledged that women are relevant in all kinds of negotiation processes. There are some even studies that talk about the ability that when we include women into the table in the negotiation process, we can also ensure bigger duration of peace too. So this is something that I think many countries, like the international society, is fairly aware of, but we still have to move, advance significantly. In the case of disarmament and arms control processes, I would have to say, and I will speak a little bit from my personal experience, that civil society had been moving a little bit ahead from the state side in terms of including women, and not only women, but also women from developing countries, like in my case, coming from Chile. I started my career as a lobbyist for the Oslo, the Ottawa process, and also the Armed Trade Treaty. And I'm in many ways a product of civil society in that regard, that they promoted women from developing countries to be in the table in the discussion. From the state perspective, my impression, being in many negotiation processes, including while working in ICANN, was that on the side of civil society, I could see that there were very high-ranking level women, highly prepared women, involved in research, involved in advocating,
But in terms of state representation, from my perspective, there was a problem concerning that many times there would be a large number, maybe like a larger number in many years, like an increase in the number of women in delegation, but not in really leadership roles in the delegations. And that is a key difference that I think we need to take into account, because one thing is to be part of a of the negotiation table, but on the other hand, the other thing is to be able to really be able to make decisions. And the key element to include women, my last point, has to do with that, with the fact that we need a diverse perspective in order to negotiate, and not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of the regional perspective. We need also in terms of developing and also countries in the process of development to be included, because the reality of women is completely different. The impact of nuclear testing, the impact of nuclear weapons is not only in terms of the immediate impact that is disastrous, but also the long terms to the communities, the societies, and their ability to further develop. And here is where women play a key role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yasmin, we have another comment here.
My name is Bauchi. I'm from the youth group. Thank you all very much for a very insightful panel. I have two questions for everyone in the panel. I'll keep it short. One is that you've touched on representation and participation and on substance, but not really on the smaller behaviors that can sometimes come up in especially, well, I mean, in such forums, academic or diplomatic or whatever, that are misogynistic or chauvinistic. And I guess Grace touched on the changing the aesthetic, and I think that is something that is very visible. So how do you react to such things and such behaviors, and should there be a difference in the reaction between men and women? Because obviously I think men don't want to be lording when they comment, but also, I mean, so what's the right way to balance that out? That's one. And then second, my second question is, you all emphasize the practical benefits of a diverse society, and I think that's a general question that I always ask myself, and somewhat philosophical. But to what extent, by emphasizing that, do we create a setback to bringing about change based on strictly moral benefits, and not on even when it doesn't have the practical benefits? So I'm always asking myself that, and I think especially when we come to discussing nuclear weapons, I think we need diversity just because we are all threatened. That's for me where it lies. So I would love you to weigh in on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more comment back here, and then we'll do another round.
Thank you. My name is Metin. I'm from Turkey. My question is for all panelists, since everyone can speak different languages. And my question is, what do you think about the effect of languages to the nuclear or gender issues? Like some languages use specific and different articles, like female and male articles. Thank you.
Well, there's a practical question. Very interesting. So I think I'll start with Grace, if you'd like to comment, and we'll just go down the line.
Thank you, everyone, for your awesome questions. So I'll just try to answer or address two briefly. First, Baruki's question on doing things for the moral benefit only. I know we like to touch on the practical side of it because we feel like there has to be, something more tangible. Perhaps this could be like a capitalist mindset, but a tangible benefit that can come from something that is more, moral or ethical in its nature. But to that point, I think at least when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I feel like it was almost more powerful, or I feel like I had some obligation to give some type of tangible recommendation or tangible reason why women should be in power. And maybe that's the problem, is that we should be able to just say, well, look at the population, it's 50-50, why isn't this the case for leadership? But yeah, I think you touched on a really, really good point, is that, you know, maybe we should go back and emphasize that moral, ethical, you know, just we should have gender balance because it's right, not because of X, Y, Z. So I think that's a really, really good point. And then as for the question for language surrounding nuclear weapons, I think I want to expand not only to language but to symbolism as well. There's a couple of very, very good articles about women, or I guess just gender in the nuclear field in general. So, for example, ballistic missiles, as you guys can all see, are gendered. It's the world's most visible male-dominating field, if I can put it that way. But I think that speaks to the population that was the original creator or the base for nuclear weapons development. It was men. And we can see that manifest in very symbolic ways, either intentionally or unintentionally, as the technology itself develops. So I think in the forthcoming generations, I think it'd be really interesting to see where nuclear, I mean, hopefully there's not much development or modernization, but if it were to continue developing, where that field would go because of more women being at the table and being on the technical side of things. Thank you.
That was interesting. To answer your question, I would say you bring up a very good point, because the moral part of it is probably what needs to ignite the rest of it. We have to ask ourselves, how did we get in the situation we're in the first place? And that's probably because it was assumed certain people had the right to do X, Y, and Z, and others should be doing something else. So over time, it creates an inequity in education, in knowledge, etc., which then exacerbates the situation. And then it moves more toward it moves away from the moral side of things to it just being an issue of competence, perhaps. So I think if we look at what some of the speakers have mentioned about, you know, setting certain thresholds that have to be part of a system, it's probably not a bad idea, because it actually provides a forum then for everyone to get the experience, to slowly bring themselves up to speed. And I hadn't looked at it from your perspective, but I think you bring up a really good point in that regard. In regard to the question on the effect of languages on the gender issue, okay, as I'm not a linguist, I can't comment on too many languages, but I mean, even just in English, we look at, you know, we used to say, the chairman of the board, we're slowly trying to move away from those words where it was the man of the board, or so it's the chairperson now, or people. And I even notice it in you know, as the chief of procurement, we send out documents and we receive documents from suppliers, and it's often referring to the vendor as he, etc. So slowly, as I check things that go out the door, I change those things, and it's one of those unconscious biases, I think, that you just get used to doing something a certain way, and so then it starts to color your view of what that person looks like, or you know, who is the sergeant here, or who's the head of the thing. So it's a good point.
Thank you. When it comes to the issue of behavior and the question of moral and ethical versus practical. I think that the example of the OSCE here is a good one, especially of the so-called first dimension, which is really the Forum for Security Cooperation, which is basically forum for military advisors. And it is a very male-dominated body of the OSCE. It's practically all male. And that is also why a couple of years ago at the OSCE, a special initiative was started, which is called the OSCE Men Engage Network, which basically engages men, both ambassadors and military advisors, in promoting gender equality and in promoting also, I would say, correct behavior. However, I also have to emphasize that in this particular forum, the issue of moral ethical just doesn't cut the chase. You actually have to show why is it better for a military operation or for a military presence or for a peacekeeping operation to have more women in the actual force, which is why we keep giving concrete examples of why that actually does make a difference on the ground, and why we keep also using the argument of why mainstreaming gender is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. And it is important to give this sort of examples also to get the doubting Thomases on your side, because that forum, being the OSCE, being an OSCE forum, is not a forum of like-minded countries, and therefore a dialogue, a convincing dialogue, is important. As far as the language impact is concerned, yes, Slovenian, like all of the other Slavic languages, differentiates male and female. In our language, we do have also female form for any leadership positions. Right now, we are getting used to the female form of the chief of the general staff, because the new deputy chief of the general staff is actually a woman. So, I mean, people get used to these forms. It is true that sometimes it is more common to have as a neutral term the masculine form, which is why all of my country was surprised last week when it transpired that the academic board of the Faculty of Philosophy has decided that in the next academic year they will actually consciously use female form for the neutral gender form, and of course all of the linguists now are having a discussion of whether or not this is okay, and how does that relate to the linguistic issues as such. But it just goes to show that you know, you can actually have a very flexible approach to these things, even if you have a very should we say slightly more complicated language. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for your comment and questions. And first, talking about the how can I say, and the difference and men and women and takes the issue and nuclear related issues. And as I mentioned in my example, there might be, and as has been mentioned, that men and women generally, in general terms, and they might take the matter differently, and that might be the case. And it would be very much natural to think that women, the gender which would be in a position to think about the next generation, and in very much matter of very much immediate concern. So, and that might be related to that. But I very much would like to think that that would be the reason why, and it would be good that we have all the party participation. And so, it would be good that we, rather than not taking either or question, but the participation and the balanced participation would be good, and that would enrich the discussion, and that would be the good place to produce a good result. And so, from that standpoint, I very much agree with what Laura said in her opening remarks. And talking about high-level participation and particularly government and policy making and level, I suppose that is already happening. And as has been mentioned by Courtney, and last week on Friday, and there was this CTBT Symposium high-level event. And I very much remember that Ms. Izumi Nakami's mentioned, oh, I come across and the recognition that all the panelists are women. We dominated. So, and as has been mentioned by Courtney, and that panel was very much well represented from women's side. And I suppose in this area, non-proliferation and disarmament, we have a distinguished figure, and starting with Laura here, and also we can mention such names as Angela Kane and Helga Schmidt, and also Izumi Nakamitsu. And we have a good deal of very much highly esteemed colleague from women. And I suppose that is very much happening. So I very much for that kind of change. Talking about the language and gender, and one thing which I would like to share with you is that in Japanese, which is my mother tongue, we have no distinction from chairman, chairperson. And there is only one word, gicho, and that is the word which we use. And we don't have gender in our noun. And I suppose the same thing can apply to Chinese. And so, some of the language doesn't have gender for nouns. And hearing the discussion, I have come up to the mind that that would be one of the solutions for addressing this issue. But this is, of course, a joke. Thank you very much.
Terrific. That's a great solution. That's a good. I really liked those questions, and I had some thoughts about it as well. The issue of the practicality as a compelling reason to change. I believe in the morality of it, but I think there are lots of occasions where people say that all sounds good, as we heard from Andrej here, that you need to. It is useful to make people aware that it is in their practical interest. And that's sometimes the way you bring them on. And luckily, there is a significant amount of data out there by PricewaterhouseCoopers, UN Women, that talks about the financial benefit of gender parity. And it's really, there's some great studies out there. And it takes sometimes hard data to convince people of the right thing. And once you get there, it's easy to convince them to pat themselves on the back. In terms of language, as a lawyer, I've always found language to be very, very important. And I had an interesting experience when I first came here. I was very new to the business, and I was the lawyer for the Department of Safeguards. And on the other side was a whole series of men negotiating for Euratom, and I was the only woman on our side. And when I walked in, one of my colleagues looked up and to all the world said, "Well, my Laura, you look so cute today." So I waited till the break, and I pulled him outside, and I said, "First of all, thanks. I really know you meant that as a compliment. But secondly, you might not want to do that again because you just undercut my value to you as your lawyer." So there are lots of times when we make those kinds of missteps, and we need to remind each other. I do it as well, those bias, oh, what's his name, as opposed to what's the person's name or whatever. So language is really, really important. I know when I correct people so that they use the word woman instead of girl, some people go, "You're just being silly about this." It's not silly. Words matter. The way one communicates matter. And we're going to have to develop those ways of communicating that demonstrate that we recognize that the world is not just a single gender, if anything but. So, enough from me. We have a little bit more time for a few more questions. Our colleague over here.
Thank you, Dr. Laura, for the opportunity. I am Joel Obengo from the Republic of Kenya. I have a question to Ambassador Andrej. I don't know whether I've gotten the name well. I noted with a lot of admiration of the gradual progression of women's participation in your civilian nuclear programs from 0% to 30%. I wanted to know whether this was as a result of maybe a legislation, affirmative action legislation, and if at all you had such a legislation, what have been the challenges the government faced in implementing this legislation? Like a challenge like maybe you don't get qualified women in nuclear science, challenge like that. Any other challenge that maybe the government has been facing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions or comments over here. Colleague from Russia.
Yes, Yelena Tsivkunova, MEFI University. Well, thank you very much for such stimulating statements about women. And I totally agree with Chris, who said that women walk through this world differently. I also think that women negotiate and express their opinions in a very, very different way. And here's a very famous story about that. Like a man would say, I think we should do it. As for a female, she would say, I feel we should do it. That's like one of the key differences. And just want to share my linguistic observation, like as far as this gender parity goes. Well, if you analyze the words non-proliferation, weapon disarmament, nuclear testing in Russian, these are neither masculine gender nor feminine gender. They're neutral gender. So maybe I think from this point of view, the Russian language is the best example of like a linguistic gender parity, because like no difference whether it is the domain of male or female, just to focus, to be involved in this field. And here's my question. It's common knowledge that women are always faced with this dilemma, whether to choose between family commitments and work commitments. And my question will be addressed to female panelists. What would be your advice, recommendation, how to better handle this, long-standing dilemma? Thank you.
Sorry, one more question at the back of the room, and then I think we'll let the panelists respond.
Hi, my name is Carlos from the United States. A couple weeks ago, Kelsey Davenport from the Arms Control Association and Alexander Bell released this article called, or a piece talking about a article and the ways that in the U.S. media landscape, some journalists tend to quote men more often than females. Is that something that you've seen within the international community in terms of the media outreach, or how women female experts get portrayed in the media?
Excellent questions. I think I'll start with Ambassador Kitano and move this way down the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much for various comments and questions, and how to respond on each issue, I suppose. And we sometimes gender and perspective can be helpful, but we should be very much carefully look at when the gender and perspective can provide a good perspective. So it is often discussed that a lot of discussion about disarmament goes around those who attach importance for disarmament, those who attach importance for security situations, but at the same time, I know many experts who women experts who attach importance for security issues, and some time ago, those who are responsible for U.S. nuclear policy happen to women, so I suppose that we should be careful about when gender perspective would be bring about a good source of discussion. But I'm generally in favor of general participation, both men and women, and that would enrich the discussion, as I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question to the gentleman from Kenya. Indeed, we do have a rather high representation of women now in our nuclear administration. It's actually 38% of the staff, and I would also like to know that 4 out of 5 of the most recent new employees, there were also women. How did we do it? There is a general culture within the Slovenian civil service of gender equality. It is a consequence also of a special program which was started about almost more than a decade ago, which really focuses on these issues. But then at the same time, I'd also like to think that it is partly because of the work-life balance, which is secured also still within the Slovenian governmental service, also when it comes to leave, pregnancy leave, also when it comes to some of the other aspects of working, which is important to women. For example, in Slovenia, a pregnancy leave does count as work experience. And in that sense, a person who is working on a PhD, a doctorate, is not actually penalized for not being around during a pregnancy or when taking care of the child. So I think that this is a combination of these particular factors which have in the end contributed to us actually having a relatively high percentage of female staff at our nuclear administration. And in a similar vein, I have to say that women are also well represented at our main nuclear power plant, also as reactor operators. And finally, and I don't know really the reason why, but the fact of the matter is that the CBRN battalion of the Slovenian Armed Forces, which actually represents for one of our niche capabilities, is the one unit of our armed forces where women are represented the most, I mean, where the percentage is the highest. So for example, when a couple of years ago I visited KFOR, the operation in Kosovo, I was greeted with the interesting sight of Slovenian soldiers in fatigues with a special sign of our CBRN battalion, which looks like something like the IAEA sign because it has this radioactive sign on it, guarding Serbian monks in their monastery. Yeah. And it actually all made sense. Yeah.
I love the fact that you said that pregnancy leave counts as work experience because actually, if you think about childcare, I've learned so much from childcare that I use in the office, I can't even tell you. But to answer your question a little bit about dealing with that balance of work and family obligations, the aim, at least for the CTBTO, is to make it easier for not just women, but for men to help take care of the families, for paternity leave to be as long as maternity leave to take care of children. I think often it's the structure has limited fathers from being able to take as active a role in the family as they may have wanted to. And we all know that children benefit substantially from having fathers be at home with them as much as mothers. And they learn different skills and different things from each parent. So I think if the structure can slowly change to make it possible for both parents to have equal flexibility, that can help a lot. I also find, or at least I found over the years in working with a number of highly qualified women, and that just because they need to take some time out of the office to deal with something, the work output is significant in many ways. So I don't know if it's because we think we have to do twice as much to prove that, taking that time off with the children, but I have never, with any of my staff or people I've worked with, found that there was a decrease in productivity because people had children. And sometimes there was an increase. So.
Thank you. Grace?
To briefly address your question, I think, again, it's going back to empowering women in being able to choose their priorities and choose whether they would like to focus on family or a career, or at different points in life, having those priorities shift. And I agree with everything that Courtney just said in promoting equality in paternity, maternity leave, empowering both the father and the mother, or non-traditional households with two mothers, two fathers to take equal stakes in childcare. But on the flip side, going back to just women in general, I think one of the things that we can do normatively again is to be okay with women who choose to pursue a career instead of a family, to value graduation or a new job or promotion for a woman just as much or even more than a wedding, for example. And I think being able to see these women who choose not to have family or children as just as successful contributing members of society, I think is incredibly important. And that's how we will get to a more gender-balanced group of professionals and experts in our field and in all fields. And then a comment for the Marticles piece. That's a fantastic article, and I really highly recommend that you read it. Thank you.
Yes, it was a great article, Carlos, and it is true. I find that even when we're looking for experts to teach our courses, and we're obviously very much impressed with the importance of having female teachers, and we lost one of our experts, and we were just racking our brains, and finally one of our Mongolian colleagues or Kazakh colleagues said, you know, there's a really bright young woman in the Austrian Foreign Ministry who can probably teach that. And I'll be damned, she was fabulous. So it's really easy to rely on the people whose names are out there, by and large, male and older. So we need to start rethinking ourselves, men and women, about reaching out to younger people, people with different points of views, people of different genders. So I think we're just about overstated, but I don't want to leave without making a comment. And it relates to the value of gender parity to all of us. There's an old saying that rising tides raise all boats. And as Andrej pointed out, gender equality is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Improving the health, safety, and economic growth of women raises the global economic level for all. Indeed, gender equality is an essential precondition to the sustainable development of economies and societies, as well as humanity writ large, at least in my view. Thank you very, very much, and may I ask you to join us in thanking the panelists for their contributions.
And thank you also to Laura for that very thoughtful moderation as well. I think we all learned a lot from that. I'm sorry to take you away from these interesting discussions, but as you know, we now are moving on to some activities and visits. You are, I hope, all aware that you have been divided into 4 groups for this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon's activities. If you don't know which group you're in, there are lists on the back on the various doors. You will find your name under group 1, 2, 3, or 4. We have 2 visits to the IDC Operations Center and to the IMS test facilities. And we have 2 analysis demonstrations. One is a waveform analysis demonstration and one is a radionuclide analysis demonstration. So the respective groups will be doing the following. I want to first ask those who are in group 3, if you can look where my hand is pointing, you will see my colleague Carolina over there. Carolina will meet everybody from group 3 to take you to the operations center tour. So if you're in group 3, can I ask you to stand up and go towards Carolina? We'll deal with the other groups in just a moment. Those on the panel, you don't have to stay and listen to me, honestly, as much as I appreciate your doing so. Thank you very much.